Tax resistance, that was the beginning, the true birth of American independence. And today I've got an example we're never taught really in government-run, tax-funded schools. An important event that happened, I believe, if my math is correct, 86 years and a day before the shot heard round the world, Lexington and Concord. Plus, I'm going to start and finish with a little wisdom that I think is very applicable today from Lysander Spooner. But first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for, well, Taxation is Theft Day, April 15th. 2024. And as I promised, let's kick it off with a little Spooner here, if I can pull up my notes here. Here from his essay on the trial by jury in 1852. This is an awesome paper. He said, discussion can do nothing to prevent the enactment or procure the repeal of unjust laws unless it be understood that the discussion is to be followed by resistance. Tyrants, Spooner wrote, care nothing for discussions that are to end only in discussion. Man, I love the way he hammers this stuff home is just awesome. Sorry about that. Discussions, he said, which do not interfere with the enforcement of their laws are but idle wind to them. This is a very important mentality that if you think you can just talk at the government people, talk to tyrants and tell them that what they're doing is wrong and petition them and ask them and tell them that you'll get rid of them. All these things are really just all discussions, and they aren't followed in most situations by things that interfere with the enforcement of their laws. And this is the same kind of mentality that the old revolutionaries had, well, during the American Revolution, the run-up to the War for Independence. For example, John Dickinson, in his great broadside against the Stamp Act, put it this way: if you comply with the act by using stamped papers, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. You unnecessarily, voluntarily establish the detestable precedent which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. So this tax, this stamp tax, if the people were to go along with it, if they were to comply with it, then that establishes the precedent to do more and more and more. And literally just asking them to stop does not interfere with the enforcement of it. Now, of course, Dickinson did not read Spooner a century later, but this is the same mentality. Maybe Spooner had read Dickinson. I know he certainly was a student of history. And anyways, Dickinson goes further. He said, the Stamp Act, therefore, is to be regarded only as an experiment of your disposition. And he actually put experiment of your disposition in quotes, or in all caps. He said, if you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, you prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you. So again, discussions that end only in discussion really is idle wind to tyrants. And whether the founding generation used that exact phrase or not, they certainly understood that compliance is violence. Compliance establishes a precedent. Compliance with stuff that they're not supposed to be doing is what they want, what the government people want, because, well, it just over time, eventually it becomes more difficult. It gets more ingrained in society. John Hancock put it this way, also in response to the Stamp Act, in a letter to his London agent, Jonathan Bernard. He said, the people of this country will never suffer themselves to be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act. And a lot of people think this approach started with James Otis Jr., the phrase, no taxation without representation. Of course, we give James Otis Jr. his due pretty often here, but it certainly goes much further back. And the American revolutionaries, unlike most people today, really knew their history. And what we're looking at today is all the way back in, first of all, 1687 in historic Ipswich, Massachusetts. And here from their website, the legendary and heroic opposition by the people and leaders of Ipswich to a tax imposed by the Crown in 1687 is commemorated on the seal of the town of Ipswich to this day, which bears the motto, the birthplace of American independence, 1687. Now, we often cite the beginning, the child, American independence was born with James Otis Jr.'s great speech against the writs of assistance, mass warrantless general warrants, mass warrantless surveillance. For example, that's a precursor to it. and his argument that an act against the Constitution is void. But certainly there are things that really were precursors in this mentality. And we can go here back to 1687. Now, a little background here. They say in the early 1680s, King Charles II of England revoked the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is exactly what they did many years later in 1774 with the Coercive Act. So the process and the response was very similar in the 1680s and the 1770s, for example. It was an attempt to bring the colonies more closely under Crown control. In 1686, former governor of New York, Sir Edmund Andros, who is the chief villain in this story today, was appointed governor of a new, what they called Dominion of New England, which included the Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island colonies. Now, here from Wikipedia, which has some interesting, again, not always my primary go-to, but sometimes they have some just good basic information here. And they point out that in March of 1687, Andros issued a proclamation stating that, so first he's named kind of the dictator of this area, and then he acts like one. He issued a proclamation stating that pre-existing laws would remain in effect till they were revised. They were going to redo all kinds of stuff. Since Massachusetts had no pre-existing tax laws, though, a scheme of taxation was created that would apply to the entire Dominion. Developed by a committee of landowners, the first proposal derived its revenues from import duties, principally alcohol. Kind of like a tea tax. After much debate, a different proposal was abruptly proposed and adopted, reviving previous Massachusetts tax laws. They had been unpopular with farmers who felt the taxes on livestock were too high. To bring in immediate revenue, Andros also received approval to increase import duties on alcohol. So they just started reinstating and adding brand new taxes in ways that had no representation for the people. It was just implemented by the thoughts of one guy, and they were not happy with this whatsoever. And here from an interesting history that's published in The Atlantic, I think this was originally written in May of 1864. John G. Palfrey, The New England Revolution of the 17th Century is the title of the article. The people had no share in the government, which was conducted by Andros with the counselors appointed by the king. So they just abolished the system that they currently were living under. They abolished the process by which they previously were able to have their representatives in whatever form they had be able to approve the taxation, and then they just implemented this taxation by fiat approach as well. Heavy taxes, he writes, were arbitrarily imposed on the inhabitants. Excessive fees were demanded for the transaction of business in the courts and public offices. That's a precursor to the Stamp Act, because everything had to have anything with paper on it, all kinds of court proceedings, business documents, all were supposed to have a stamp on it, and that increased the cost. Now, some people argued, and this was John Dickinson's response, some people argued, it's not so oppressive that we can't deal with it. Why should we stick our necks out on this? But he said, as soon as you do this, they're going to do more and more and more. We have to understand that government power always grows. And once you give them that detestable precedent through your compliance, it's only going to get worse. Dickinson, I would assume, knew this history as well. The ancient titles to land, there was also a land controversy. Ancient titles to land in the colony were declared to be worthless, again, by government fiat, arbitrary power. And proprietors were required to secure themselves by taking out new patents from the governor, for which high prices were extorted. You just all of a sudden had to start paying extra fees and proving somehow that you owned what you already owned, maybe for a generation or two or longer. And this really caused a lot of problems. And here again from Wikipedia, many Massachusetts communities stiffly resisted the first attempts to enforce the revenue laws. Several towns refused to choose commissioners to assess the town population and estates. So if they didn't have someone doing assessments, they did not have the commissioner to do the job, that kind of broke down the entire system. This is really an act of nullification. When we talk about our nullification process of today, it is a combination of a refusal to comply by the people and a refusal to help enforce by the local government agencies or local governments, state governments, for example. And this is the same process that was happening all the way back in 1687. Several towns refused to choose commissioners to assess the town population and estates, and officials from a number of them were consequently arrested and brought to Boston. So even under the threat of arrest, they stood firm on what they believed was right. And then when they were arrested for doing the right thing, they worked to actually publish that and get more people on board with them. Today, unfortunately, there's not much backbone like that. And most people tell us, well, we often hear from people, oh, this nullification thing sounds really, really great and all, but what happens when they come and arrest you? Well, let's get to that here in just a moment. Back to historicipswich.net, Reverend John Wise, this is a guy who was leading the resistance. He was outraged. A born rabble-rouser. He jumped on his horse and flew from Chabaco. A quick point. I think it was a speech by Calvin Coolidge. Maybe it was like the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. He actually cited John Wise and pointed to him as an influence on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Whether Jefferson used some of the things that Wise had written in the early 1700s or not, I don't actually know that history well enough. But it's important to note that at one point, John Wise was seen as a hero. He's fallen down the memory hole, and of course, government-run, tax-funded schools are a big part of that. But he was a born rabble-rouser. He jumped on his horse and flew from the Chabaco Parish to call on brothers Sam and John Appleton. Like Sam and John Adams, I guess. Along with several other town leaders, they planned their strategy and in a hurriedly called meeting the next day, convinced residents to stand firm against unjust taxation and the loss of local rule. Again, this is the precursor to what we saw in the response to the Stamp Act. Patrick Henry's great Virginia results against the Stamp Act had the same mentality. Like, if we're going to have a taxation here, it's going to be up to us to decide. And anything that they try to do from the outside, you are not bound to yield obedience. That was Patrick Henry's take, and I'm certain he would know this history as well. Now, mind you, the town had already voted unanimously a couple years earlier in February of 1865 against the surrender of their charter when it was dissolved and they installed Andros, and at this meeting refused to appoint a tax collector. So the committee convinced the people to say they're not going to appoint a tax collector, so they're not going to be able to do this, and then encourage the people to be on board with this process where they're refusing to pay. A town meeting, they write, was hastily organized the next day, and Mr. Wise addressed the assembled men with an impassioned address that is said to have greatly affected his audience. No copy of the speech is known to exist, but it moved the meeting to vote that, quote, no taxes should be levied upon the subjects without consent of the assembly chosen by the freeholders. This is really a precursor to that great slogan of, well, no taxation without representation. We actually have a history from the minutes of the meetings and all that here, which will be linked to in the show notes. I'll get to that in a moment. This is from Complaints of Great Wrongs Done Under the Ill Government of Sir Edmund Andros, governor in New England in the year of 1687. About the 22nd day of August in that year, several principal inhabitants of the town of Ipswich met at Mr. John Appleton's, and there discoursed and concluded that it was not the town's duty any way to assist that ill method of raising money without a general assembly. In other words, they, under their tradition, under their laws that they had been following for, well, their whole lives, they had a certain process, and then it was just changed through the will of the crown and this installed governor who said, well, this is what we're going to do. And their mentality wasn't, well, let's comply with it, and then we'll try to convince them to stop it later on. Today we have so many versions of that. Comply with it and wait for part of the government, like the federal courts, to tell the other part of the federal government to stop doing what the federal government was never authorized to do in the first place. Or we'll try to get new bums in office in the hopes that those people will somehow convince the other people in office to stop doing what they were never supposed to do in the first place. This is all about sitting and waiting and complying on your knees until somehow the government decides that the government made a mistake. This is the wrong attitude, which is why James Iredell in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention told us that the only resource against usurpation, the only resource, not just a good idea, the only resource against usurpation of power is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. So they said, It's not their job to help them violate the charter that they'd been living under, to violate their rights, to impose this taxation by arbitrary power by fiat. The town then considered that the said act doth infringe their liberty as freeborn English subjects of His Majesty by interfering with the statute laws of the land, by which it was, you hear these phrases that are very familiar, law of the land, the supreme law of the land is how we have it today, by which it was enacted that no taxes should be levied upon the subjects without consent of an assembly chosen by the freeholders for assessing of the same. So this was their process. This is how they wanted to live. This was their preference. And when it was changed out of nowhere, then they weren't too happy. So that was August 22nd, 1687, where they first met at Mr. John Appleton's. And then on the 23rd, the next day, they had a general meeting of all the town inhabitants. I'm not sure if everyone showed up at that point, but my understanding of these Massachusetts-style town meetings was these are pretty small towns, especially in comparison today. So generally when they had a town meeting, everyone was there and voiced their opinion. And they had this resolution. The resolution was, they do therefore vote that they are not willing to choose a commissioner for such an end without such privilege. And moreover, consent not that the selectmen do proceed to lay any such rate until it be appointed by a general assembly concurring with the governor and the council. This is August 23rd, 1687. There is actually a plaque, a marker in Ipswich right now that's called the Revolution of 1689, where they have a marker for this event. Here on August 23rd, 1687, the citizens of Ipswich, led by the Reverend John Wise, denounced the levy of taxes by the arbitrary government of Sir Edmund Andros, and from their protest sprang the American Revolution of 1689. There was another revolution that we never talk about. I'm going to get to that in just a moment, but I first want to point out that all these original source documents, plus, Lysander Spooner's paper that I've mentioned, the essay on the trial by jury. I also got another one called No Treason Number 6. All this will be linked to in the show notes. We have a blog post for every single episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Alan Mosley organizes all the blog posts. He puts the links that I'm mentioning, plus all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and X and LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitch. We also live stream over at Odyssey.com and Rumble.com. I believe the idea for this episode came from a comment. I'm not sure if it was Odyssey or Rumble, but I certainly saw a comment on one of our episodes last week that said, for tax day coming up, you guys should do something about resistance to it. And, rather than the standard, of course, we've all heard some version of story of the Boston Tea Party and the response to the Stamp Act. But this precursor is something I've never discussed with anyone. And I thought it was really important to understand. If we want to understand the motivations and the principles of the founders and the old revolutionaries, we have to understand what they learned, what their heritage, what their tradition was. And this was a big part of it. This was an important part of it, of this type of resistance. They didn't just spring up these ideas out of nowhere. So Alan will get this published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I appreciate all the comments that people leave us because it gives me a lot of ideas for episodes. Sometimes you challenge some of the things that I mention, and it really helps me improve my work here as well. I also want to say a quick hello to everyone over in the live chat. I appreciate you being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, there's Cheriton and Haji, Hardknack Farms, King Nobody, Ragnar, John, Blue Sky, Melody Skaman. Cool. I'm seeing a bunch of names here that some of them I haven't seen in quite a while. So I appreciate you guys being here on the live stream. Sonny, JC, Senator DT, Crew Chief, and a few others. According to Waz is a good one. Again, I appreciate you being here. Please continue leaving comments, live or in the archive, reviews on Apple Podcasts, subscribe, get notifications. All that stuff will help trigger the platforms and tell their algorithms to show us to more people. But let's get back to this important history, this birth of American independence in Ipswich, Mass. So I think it was 6 people. I'll find out. I know I have it in my notes here in a moment. 6 of the people who led this effort just to get this resolution passed, which I believe was passed unanimously there in Ipswich. They were charged with crimes, contempt and high misdemeanors. They were denied habeas corpus. And here, in our defense, was pleaded the repeal of the law of assessment upon the place, also the Magna Carta of England, and the statute laws that secure the subjects' properties and estates, etc. So they made a defense that was just based on the law. Now, mind you, that doesn't work too well today. We're often told by people in the legal profession who are actually friends of the Constitution and liberty. There aren't many, but those of you out there, we love you. Well, we love our enemies as well, too. They're just harder to kind of get along with them sometimes. But we're often told that the 10th Amendment in a federal court case is never the right argument. You basically get laughed out of there. They're not going to pay attention to this. So this is kind of the approach that they took back then. They're assuming, well, this is the law. This is how it's been. Well, how can we not have habeas corpus? This has been around for centuries. And this is part of the laws that we have as Englishmen. To which was replied by one of the judges, the rest by silence assenting, that we must not think the laws of England will follow us to the ends of the earth, or whither we went. So, in other words, yeah, you may have had those laws, but they're not in force here anymore. You may have lived under them. Your entire family ancestry may have lived under these laws, but I'm telling you, it doesn't count anymore. And that's the way that government always acts. When government can get away with doing whatever government wants, it doesn't matter what you have on paper. Government will always ignore it. Words on paper have never enforced themselves. They never did, and they never will. It really takes the backbone of the people, just like when we started out here in the show with Lysander Spooner. Discussions that end only in discussion are idle wind to tyrants. Now, Mr. Wise, this is what one of the judges said. Mr. Wise, you have no more privileges left you than not to be sold for slaves. And no man in the council contradicted. So he basically said, your only right is to not be chattel slave. That's it. Anything else is up to us. That is the epitome of arbitrary power, government by political power, by the force of a gun at least. They point out here that we were remanded from verdict to prison. They were all convicted. They were banned from office. They were given fines. Each of them were given bonds that they had to post somewhere between 500 and 1,000 pounds, a lot of money. We were remanded from verdict to prison, and there kept 1 in 20 days for judgment. There, with Mr. Dudley's approbation, and Judge Stoughton said this sentence was passed. So John Wise was suspended from ministerial functions, fined £50, and had to pay a cost £1,000 bond for the good behavior of 1 year. So in other words, you put up this bond, and if you don't cause any more trouble for a year, you'll get your money back. But if they want to keep their money, they're going to just say you're a problem. John Appleton, fine of $50, £1,000 bond. This will be linked to in the show notes. If you want to get those details and learn more about it, it will be there as well. Now, one consequence, this is from the overview of Mr. Andros, one consequence of the tax protest was that Andros sought to restrict town meetings, since these were where that protest had begun. And again, this is the same type of thing that the Crown did in response to the resistance to the various tax acts, the Stamp Act, the Townsend Act, the Tea Act. Once you start doing these things, once you start getting a little too uppity and thinking that you have rights that don't depend on their approval, they will just try to shut down what you do. Of course, they suspended legislatures in North Carolina. They suspended them in Massachusetts and elsewhere. And New York, we know that the New York Restraining Act was one of the reasons that John Dickinson wrote his famous Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. He said, if they can do it to them, they can do it to all of us. So we have to, even if we don't think it affects us today, we have to actually take a stand against this. And Concordia res parve crescunt, that was the message that he put in Latin. Small things grow great by concord, so any type of opposition was important. So Andros sought to restrict town meetings since these were where that protest had begun. Restrictions on free speech. We also know that Benjamin Franklin, very young in life, I don't know if it was 1720s or 1730s, but he basically said those who want to overthrow the liberty of a nation must first begin by subduing the freeness of speech. This wasn't about totally shutting down free speech to kick it off, but when you want to overthrow liberty, your first step is to subdue freeness of speech. And restricting town meetings, especially at that time when that was the way that the town communicated with each other and strategized what they were going to do, restricting their ability to plan and strategize resistance was how, well, tyrants think of, well, breaking up the resistance. He therefore then introduced a law that limited meetings to a single annual meeting solely for electing officials, and explicitly banned meetings at other times for any reason. So no town meetings whatsoever. This loss of local power was widely hated. Many protests were made that the town meeting and tax laws were violations of Magna Carta, just like they did in court, which guaranteed taxation by representatives of the people. And this back and forth, the tax by arbitrary fiat, the resistance to it, the planning of the meetings, the shutdown of free speech and free assembly. This back and forth, which has a lot of similarities to what went down in the years that led up to the War for Independence, the real American Revolution, led to something on April 18th called the Revolt of 1689. Again, I'm not sure if my math is correct. I went to a government-run school, so some things I did not learn other than just history. So I think it's 86 years and a day before Lexington and Concord. At about 5 a.m. on April 18th, militia companies began gathering outside Boston at Charleston, just across the Charles River, and at Roxbury, located at the far end of the neck connecting Boston to the mainland. Again, discussions and only in discussions that end only in discussions are nothing. It's idle wind to tyrants. So if you don't interfere with the enforcement of their laws, they're going to keep going with it. So they interfered with the enforcement. The government ramped it up. They're going to keep pushing it until people back down. And eventually, sometimes they have to ramp it up a little further. And that's what happened here on April 18th. This is again 2 years after this whole tax thing started in Ipswich in 1687. At about 8 a.m., the Charleston companies boarded boats and crossed the river while Roxbury companies marched down the neck and into the city. Simultaneously, men from the ancient and honorable artillery company, that's an important one to learn about some other time, entered the homes of the regimental drummers in the city, confiscating their equipment. The militia companies met at about 8:30, joined by a growing crowd, and began arresting Dominion and regimental leaders. I mean, literally, the backbone that these people had. They went in, organized a militia, called people to arms, and then arrested the government officials. Now, I'm not saying that that may be the best strategy for today, but it certainly might be something to think about another time. They eventually surrounded Fort Mary, where Andros was quartered. Now, sometime before noon, this breaks down pretty quickly. An orange flag was raised on Beacon Hill, signaling another 1,500 militiamen to enter the city. These troops formed up in the market square where a declaration was read. I have the full text of the declaration. Some of it is kind of like a list of grievances. So we see this tradition of listing out the grievances, explaining what went down and what the way things are supposed to be and why you're fighting, why you're saying no to these people. So this kind of process is very old school. 1689, they write, in little more than half a year, we saw this commission superseded by another, yet more absolute and arbitrary. So they're talking about the new Dominion, with which Sir Edmund Andros arrived as our governor, who besides his power, with the advice and consent of his council to make laws and raise taxes as he pleased. Arbitrary power is listed as one of the so-called grievances. They're injuries and usurpations in the Declaration of Independence. This is arbitrary, unlimited power, power without right. This is also one of the things that they mentioned in the reason why they were fighting. The Declaration drafted by John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson and passed by the Continental Congress on July 6, 1775, just months after the fighting really started ramping up there. And they said, look, why we shouldn't even have to list all of our issues in detail because they claim unlimited power over us in all cases whatsoever. Again, a tip of the hat to the Declaratory Act. So arbitrary, unlimited power of one dude or a group of people saying they can do what they want when they want, resistance to that, not just opposition in word, but resistance in action as well, is a long part of the American tradition, going well before the founding generation and the old revolutionaries. Back to this resolution, or this document that was read there. Several companies of redcoats were now brought from Europe to support was what to be imposed upon us, not without repeated menaces that some hundreds more were intended for us. This is also a precursor to the opposition to standing armies, using the military to enforce the will of arbitrary power, and then also recognizing that once you allow one thing to happen, you're going to have hundreds more problems that were intended for us. They don't even know what could have been coming next. And they certainly had a recognition that this would establish a precedent. So by around 10 a.m. on, I think it was on the 18th, most of these officials were arrested or they fled. And they point out here as well, it is now plainly affirmed by some in open council and by the same in private converse that the people in New England were all slaves. And the only difference between them and slaves is they're not being bought and sold. This is directly pointing back to the court case where John Wise was told your only right is not to be sold as chattel slavery. And so they recognized that this was really, this was the shot heard round the world, at least at that point. It was a maxim delivered in open court onto us by one of the council. Persons who did but peaceably object against the raising of taxes without an assembly have been for it fined some 20, some 30, others 50 pounds. They have made laws for us is impossible for us to know, as dangerous for us to break, but we shall leave the men of Ipswich and Plymouth and others to tell the story of the kindness which has been shown them upon this account. So again, this all started out with a tax imposed by the will of one person. That person was put in power by the will of one person. It shut down the code of laws, the Constitution, the charter, I guess we could say, of what they had lived under. And when government starts doing that, they're always going to do more and more and more. We know that once they have the power to do one thing, if people don't like it, then they're going to send armed forces to try to shut those people down. They're going to stop free speech. So many of the things that we learned about the American Revolution as well. Here from Wiki, the Massachusetts colonial leadership headed by ex-governor Simon Bradstreet, because once everyone was arrested, they started reinstating their previous governments. They just did it. So the colonial leadership headed by ex-governor Simon Bradstreet then urged Governor Andros to surrender for his own safety. He refused and tried to escape to Rose, but the militia intercepted a boat that came ashore from Rose, and Andros was forced back into Fort Mary. So he's trying to flee. Even though everything is breaking down, they're reaffirming their own local power. He's trying to get away, and then there's some negotiations. These ensued, and Andros agreed to leave the fort to meet with the council. He was promised safe conduct and marched under guard to the townhouse where the council had assembled. There he was told, quote, they must and would have the government in their own hands, as an anonymous account describes it, and that he was under arrest. And so he decided, okay, there's nothing I can do at this point. I will agree to this. I'm going to back down. I'm out of here. And once Andros's arrest was known, as I was mentioning, the discussion, because they've reestablished their local colonial governments that they had prior to Andros being installed, then we go back to London. They point out that the discussion in London turned to dealing with Massachusetts and its revoked charter. This led to formation of the province of Massachusetts Bay in 1691, merging Massachusetts with Plymouth Colony and territories previously belonging to New York, including Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, and the Elizabeth Islands, and parts of Maine. And here from the king, this is from William III, I believe. They had been sending letters explaining what went down. The king actually responded. And this is interesting because if you think about how all the petitions went down during the American Revolution in the 18th century, they were petitioning. They thought they could reason with the king and tell the king, look, this is what's going on. Your people that have been installed here have been violating our ancient rights. You know, once you know about this, everything's going to be cool. And they learned that the king was the bad guy as well. And maybe they got the idea from William III because he responded very positively. We have therefore thought fit hereby to signify our royal approbation of the same and gracious acceptance of your readiness in performing what was necessary on your parts for the preservation of the peace and quiet of our said colony. Just reaffirming, okay, all is great. You guys did a great job. We do hereby authorize and empower you to continue in our name and your care in the administration thereof, and the preservation of the peace, until we shall have taken such resolutions and given such directions for the more orderly settlement of the said government, as shall most conduce to our service and the security and satisfaction of our subjects within that colony. So basically, here's what went down. We took over, we reinstated what we had before, and we're letting you know, what do we do next? And the king responded, it's all good. Just keep going with what you're doing until we decide what's coming next. And I think we can wrap this up with another message from Lysander Spooner. And this applies, he wasn't writing about this history, but it applies, I think, directly as well. This is from No Treason number 6. I think it was published in 1870. He said, the lesson taught by all these facts is this. As long as mankind continue to pay national debts, so-called, that is, so long as they are such dupes and cowards as to pay for being cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, so long will there be enough to lend the money for those purposes. And with that money, a plenty of tools called soldiers can be hired to keep them in subjection. So the lesson that Lysander Spooner has for us today that I'm sharing with you, that I hope is a powerful one, is as long as people get down on their knees and comply, as long as they submit to arbitrary measures, James Otis Jr. told us, so long will they find masters. As long as people continue to comply with stuff that they're never supposed to be complying with in the first place, government will never stop. And Spooner summed it up with this. But when they refuse any longer to pay for being thus cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, they will cease to have cheats and usurpers and robbers and murderers and blood money loan mongers for masters. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. This was not something I learned in government-run school, so I had to go out and search for this. And if you want to help us reach and teach more and more people, as we do every single day, with this foundational, essential historical information, the strategy we can learn from it as well, nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they keep devaluing, please consider throwing it our way. Over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, we have a membership program that starts out as little as $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Don't feel obligated, but again, there's nothing that helps us do this work more, and I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to us. I'm going to check through the live chat a little bit more later today. I see some back and forth from Rights Are Not Tradition and Brewster and Haji and Melody and a few others. I appreciate all the feedback. Again, I get a lot of great ideas for future episodes. I got this idea from a comment. I think it was actually on Rumble, so thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you had an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.